Thanks, Amber. Welcome, everybody. Really excited to have you here today to join us for this conversation. We have a really great expert within our wildlife section. Again, my name is Jeff Letterman. I'll be your host today. I'm the supervisor of our education skills team and outreach within Fish and Wildlife at the DNR. And I'm just going to do a little introduction for Nicole here, and then we'll turn it over to her, and she will give us a lot of great information. Nicole Davros is the supervisor for the Farmland Wildlife Populations and Research Group located in Medelia, Minnesota. She's originally from a south suburb of Chicago. She has spent most of her adult life living and conducting ornithological research in other places, including southern Minnesota, east central and southern Illinois, New Hampshire, and Panama. Nicole received her BS degree in ecology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, her MS degree in animal ecology from Iowa State University, and her PhD at the University of Illinois. Her main research interests are in avian ecology and conservation in agricultural working landscapes. In her free time, she enjoys spending time biking, hiking, and exploring Minnesota with her husband. I'm really excited to hear about this topic, Nicole, because I way back many years ago spent several months at Medelia helping out with farmland wildlife research. So really glad you're here today to share some of the great things that have been going on across the state and that way hunters can participate and help support our efforts as we do this research and manage our fish and game population. So take it away.
Thank you, Jeff, and yeah, thank you everyone for attending today. I love hearing about, let me get my screen going here while I'm doing that. I love hearing about all the alumni from Medelia. There are a lot more of you than you might realize and then that I ever realized. So, all right, so I should be sharing now, and I have unmuted myself, so we should be good to go. Again, thanks everyone for coming today. Going to learn a little bit more about hunters as citizen scientists. Before I jump into that, I do want to give a few, let's see, why is it not advancing? Hang on one second here. There we go. Just a few disclaimers before we get rolling. Unlike a lot of our other MOS webinars, this is not necessarily a skills-based one. However, I am going to be highlighting opportunities for participation and scientific contribution, so hopefully you're excited about that. And then I'll also offer up that I recognize this is very much a section of wildlife based and also biased perspective. We know that we have other divisions and other people doing good work using citizen science, a lot of other agencies using citizen science as well too. But admittedly, those are not well represented here today. In the link, there will be, or in the chat, there will be some links to some of those other citizen science-based projects. But again, today we're going to focus on some hunter-based citizen science projects that we do within our research group. Also, you're going to hear me plug this a few times and later explain why I'm plugging it so heavily. We really do ask that if you're a hunter and receive any of these surveys that you participate. These surveys are reliant on hunters as participants. And whether you're a hunter or not, we ask that you help spread the word to your friends and family who are hunters. Okay, so here's a little overview of the talk. I think before I jump into these hunter-based citizen science projects, and I'm going to focus highlight two of them today. I wanted to talk a little bit about our wildlife research unit and who and where we are and the type of work we do to kind of set the stage for why these surveys are important. So if you're not familiar, Minnesota DNR is just a large agency. Our wildlife research unit is within the Division of Fish and Wildlife, and in particular section of wildlife. And our research unit is made up of 4 different groups. I'm with the Farmland Wildlife Populations and Research Group, which is located in Medelia, represented by the green star on the map there. We're down in south central Minnesota. Our Forest Research Group is out of Grand Rapids, kind of the orange or brown, depending on your monitor, star there. Our Wetlands Group is the blue star, and they're out of Bemidji. And then our Wildlife Health Program is out of Carlos Avery. If you're not familiar with Carlos Avery, it's one of our major management units located in Forest Lake, not too far outside of the Twin Cities, and a really neat place to check out. Lots of different activities there. You don't need to be a hunter to appreciate Carlos Avery. So if you're in the Twin Cities or if you're ever passing through close by, I recommend you check out Carlos Avery. And then we have a variety of other staff that are kind of spread around, mostly in St. Paul or at Carlos Avery. That includes our wildlife biometricians. They're essentially our statisticians. We have a human dimensions research scientist who helps do a lot of the citizen science work that we do, and then a federal AIDS grant biologist, among others. In our farmland group, we focus on upland game species, primarily upland game birds like ringneck pheasants and wild turkeys. But we also do research and monitoring of other species as needed as research or management questions come up. So tree squirrels are a good example. A few years ago, we had a survey, or excuse me, a research project to look at how harvest mortality was contributing to overall mortality rates of squirrels in southeast Minnesota. On the ungulate side of our office, our research staff focus on white-tailed deer and elk research and monitoring. In our forest group, we have scientists and biologists who work with fur bearers and large carnivores. So bears, wolves, fishers, martens, among others. We have grouse scientists and researchers who focus on things like our native prairie grouse and our forest species. So greater prairie chickens, sharp-tailed grouse, ruffed grouse, and spruce grouse. And then we have a moose and deer researcher as well too. And that moose and deer researcher focuses more so on deer in the northern forests, whereas our farmland group does tend to work statewide because of the research and monitoring types of projects we do. Our wetlands group focuses on waterfowl, so ducks and geese, swans, other water birds as well too, things like sandhill cranes, and then wetland ecology as well too, those habitats that are extremely important to those water birds. And one example, when you think about wetland ecology, one recent example of some research and monitoring they've done is an amphipod study. And if you're not familiar with amphipods, there's a picture of them in the top left there. They're tiny little invertebrates that are the base of the food chain and incredibly important nutritious food for waterfowl and other wetland associated wildlife. So they're looking at a study to figure out if we can stock amphipods or otherwise manage wetlands to increase amphipods to provide that food source that is so important for waterfowl, not only waterfowl that breed here in Minnesota, but also those passing through on their way north. And then we have our wildlife health program, as I mentioned there, Carlos Avery, but they respond to emerging wildlife health issues across the state. So one of the things you're probably most familiar with and have heard about is our chronic wasting disease surveillance efforts. But then they also respond to other things like avian influenza outbreaks, rabbit hemorrhagic disease, and you've probably hopefully heard about the moose project that they had completed in the last decade or so, looking at trying to figure out why our moose population is declining and what wildlife health issues might be at play in explaining that decline. Okay, so for a minute, I want you to close your eyes. And when you think about a wildlife researcher, a wildlife biologist, a wildlife scientist, think about what you picture us doing. And then you can go ahead and open your eyes and tell me where you think you fall on this spectrum. There's definitely what my friends think I do. There's what my mom thinks I do. There's what society and Hollywood think we do. But I'd like to think that I do, which is being out in the field, getting my hands on some of the animals, doing the actual on-the-grounds research. But the reality is that for most of us at this point in our careers, what we actually do is sit behind the desk a lot, and that's okay. That's just a natural progression. But there's a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes before you ever see some of these cool pictures I'll be showing, and that I've already showed during this talk. And that's just the nature of the game. We have to sit behind the desk, write up project proposals, analyze the data, write the reports, and that's just an important part of the work. But all jokes aside, the type of work we do in the most basic sense, and I've said it a few times, is research and monitoring of our wildlife populations and their habitats. We also mix in that human dimensions research, which is essentially the application of theories and methods from the social sciences to help understand the preferences and behaviors of our natural resource stakeholders, whether they be hunters or other members of the public. In our wildlife research unit, we focus on game species, but our topics are wide-ranging and inclusive when applicable. So for example, my colleagues and I just recently completed a study looking at the potential for insecticide drift to drift onto our public grasslands and the implications it might have for our game birds, as well as our songbirds and pollinators. So even though it was focused on game species and our public WMAs, which are, have a lot of uses, but are used heavily by hunters, we did have these implications for other wildlife that are out there. Our goal is to gather information through our research and monitoring projects to inform the rules and regulations and management efforts. This includes all of our efforts to set hunting and season regulations, including bag limits. Our goal is also to use the best available science to inform decision making and ultimately, to help conserve, protect, and perpetuate Minnesota's wildlife. We're doing our job right. We're working closely with our land managers and decision makers and partners each step of the way. And we're using the scientific process at its core. So sit behind the desk, identify that research, work with those land managers and decision makers and partners to figure out where are the information gaps, what research or monitoring do we need to do to address those information gaps, and then develop projects, obtain funding, go out and conduct the actual field research, and then come back, analyze that data, write up the reports, and disseminate it. Whether it's through a peer-reviewed scientific publication or whether it's through an outreach talk or a professional society meeting or meeting with our wildlife managers again to tell them what we learned. We use a variety of tools and approaches to do this work. So as I mentioned, we have statisticians on staff who help with consulting, help keep us on track with how we design and analyze our projects. We've had staff in the past who've helped advance statistical approaches that we use. So an example of that is a lot of times we're doing cause-specific mortality. And you go out and you're like, well, I think this squirrel is dead, but I'm not sure, like, because when I tapped on the tree, the collar stayed put, but a squirrel jumped out of the hole. And so we kind of incorporate expert knowledge, and well, maybe the collar just fell off, and we can kind of incorporate that behind the scenes into the statistical models that we do. And so we've had staff in the past who've helped advance that, which is kind of a really neat thing. And reasons why I'm glad there's people smarter than me who can help us advance those statistical approaches. And then we also have a lot of citizen science approaches, which often employ these app-based. So a lot of our surveys rely on, surveys that are application-based. You can take them on your phone and go. So when you're in the field, you can enter the data. In the bottom right corner, I'm showing a screenshot from our Enter a Bear sighting webpage. And so this is kind of a citizen science-based project, but also app-based, where any member of the public, if they spot a bear outside of the primary bear range, so primary bear range there being the black area, and then the green being kind of new areas that bears might be wandering into. If you happen to spot a bear when you're out and about and you want to report it, that app is a great way to do that, and anybody can participate in that. And then also advancing some of the technology or methodologies we use. And so those other three pictures on the screen to the left are from a project run out of our farmland group, looking at fawn survival, movement, and habitat use. And so to go out and find a bunch of fawns to be able to study them can be really time intensive if you're relying on boots on the ground. A lot of volunteers have been used in the past for these types of studies. And so our staff and our farmland group decided to see if drones would work. And so there's a picture of a drone there on the road. That square pink picture is basically an infrared image of a grassland site, a grassland WMA, either at night or with a lot of cloud cover. And so we get a good difference in that thermal heat signature. And that little hot dot in the center is a fawn that's curled up taking a nap, waiting for its mom to come back and feed it. And so what our team figured out is that drones are a really effective and efficient way to find fawns. They can mark the location, and then we can send a foot crew in directly to that spot to capture that fawn, take some measurements, place an expandable GPS collar on them. So this is a project that's not only used technology like drones, but also advanced the methodology, and that this is the first study that we know of that's using an expandable GPS collar to track those fawns through the first 1.5 years of their life. So that's been pretty exciting. So again, I want to focus today on some of these hunter-based citizen science projects, but that's just a little bit of background about our research unit, the type of work we do and where we do it. And before I jump into these two specific examples, I just want to quickly go through some other examples of projects led by staff in our wildlife research unit that are hunter-based citizen science projects. It's, again, by no means a complete list, but I just kind of wanted to give you an example of some other things that we do. So I already mentioned the Report a Bear Sighting app. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are some screenshots of our small game hunter harvest survey. We also do an annual trapper harvest survey. And so if you're a small game hunter and you've bought a license, maybe you've been randomly selected for this survey before. And in it, it's pretty simple. We just ask for you to report the number of days you hunted, the county that you primarily hunted in, and the number of species that you bagged. And from that information, we can then generate estimates of, how many pheasants were harvested in the last year, how much effort did hunters put in, what was their success rate. And over time, those surveys help give us basically a trend or an index of how things are looking with our populations over time. They're kind of high level, and the data sets behind them are messy, but they are really important surveys that over time help us track and monitor these populations so that we can then, if need be, go back and inform the season setting process. We have some other studies where we've recruited hunters to participate, and we're relying on them to send us in some biological samples from after their harvest. So some examples of that are a ruffed grouse study looking at whether ruffed grouse were exposed to West Nile virus, and then a deer study looking at whether deer have been exposed to neonics, or neonicotinoids is the long form of the name, commonly referred to as neonics. And neonics are essentially a type of insecticide used for a variety of purposes throughout the state. And so for both of these projects, we recruit hunters. And if they want to participate, we then send them a kit. After they harvest an animal, so whether it's a grouse or a deer, they then send in a feather sample or fur sample, maybe a tooth sample if it's a deer, and then a variety of biological samples. So for the deer study, we asked for them to return a spleen. For the ruffed grouse study, it was things like a little blot of blood on a special paper, and then I think they asked for like a spleen or a liver and a heart in the heart. So these are really neat studies. The hunters who enroll in them are really happy. It gives them an excuse to get out in the fall and do some hunting. Not that they didn't have excuses already, but then also contribute to these studies that would otherwise not be possible without those hunters participating in them. Okay, so again, quick overview of just some of the other studies, but let's jump into my first real example, this deer hunter observation survey. And so there'll be a link in the chat taking you to this website if you're interested. This is a survey that's open to all hunters in the state. I'll get into it here in a minute. It used to be available, it used to be that it was just for archery hunters, and it's been expanded to all deer hunters. And I'll just point out that the green button there, the login entry, is currently deactivated because we're kind of in between, but that link will go active again here in September, probably right before archery season opens on September 17th. So if you go to it now, don't worry, that link will become active again here in the next couple of weeks. But this is where you would go to help log deer sightings. And a little bit of background about why this hunter observation survey is so important. So what you're maybe used to seeing is our regulations book that comes out every year. So the rules and regulations for when you go afield. Or maybe you're used to seeing or taking pictures with your friends and family, enjoying time afield, or sharing these photos of people smiling really big because they've had a successful hunt. And so what you might not realize is that behind the scenes, there's a lot of work that goes in by all of our staff in the section of wildlife to help set these seasons. And for deer hunting in particular, the first step in the process is our population modeling that happens every spring. So the first step to helping set those deer seasons is the population model. At its core, the deer population model is a simple formula. You take the population in 1 year, you add in the number of animals born, the number that may be moved into the area. So in this case, moving in would maybe be like a DPA or a deer permit area. You subtract out the animals that died, and that then gives you the population, the starting population for the next year. If you like pictures better, here's another way to look at the deer population model. Again, we start with the deer population in year 1, and we maybe even have information on the number of bucks, does, and fawns. We subtract out adult survival, fawn survival, harvest and registration. And then we also factor in winter severity, because we know that for deer, especially in the northern forests, the more severe the winter, the lower the survival rate. But then we add back in fecundity. And so fecundity is just essentially, the number of fawns that a doe gives birth to on average. And so this is the start of that season setting process. Before we can set bag limits and know what the DPA, what each DPA should look like, and put out those maps and things that you see in that regs book, we need to do this deer population model to figure out what the population looks like from 1 year to the next. The problem with the deer population model is that we start with that pre-fawn population density. So what is the population density kind of coming out of winter before fawning begins? And we only estimate that for that first year. But the modeling process goes through 5 iterations of this formula. And so what essentially happens is the model over time can get a little bit, for lack of a better scientific term, can get a little wobbly or wonky. And so we need to go back in and recalibrate that model. We have that starting population density estimate, but we occasionally need to do density estimates to feed back into the model to correct it along the way. And so this is where our farmland group, even though we're a farmland group, I mentioned earlier that we tend to work statewide because we have to go in and do these recalibration efforts. And so some of the things we've done in the past to figure out density estimates for specific DPAs are things like aerial deer surveys, or we're currently looking at whether a road-based distance sampling survey can work in the farmland region. And I don't want to get too into the weeds. Aerial surveys work really great for the transition zone, but not necessarily the forest zone or the farmland zone. They're costly. There's safety concerns. You got to wait for the right weather conditions and things like that. So we are investigating other ways to help monitor our population and come up with some trend indexes to, maybe not density estimates per se, but some trend indexes to help us recalibrate that model. And so, and then I also mentioned that fawn mortality and movement study. So that one in particular is trying to update the survival rate estimates for fawns in our farmland DPAs, because the last time we did a study of fawn survival in our farmland region was something like 30 years ago or more. We know our landscape has changed. Maybe the number of predators, the composition of the predator community has changed. And so that's where that study comes in. We're trying to update those survival estimates. But the Deer Hunter Observation Survey is basically a monitoring project that over time can give us not necessarily an estimate in the number of deer out there like an aerial survey would do, but it would give us some trend or some indices over time that would help us recalibrate that model. So again, that's the kind of the reason for this Deer Hunter Observation Survey. And this is what it looks like on the website. But essentially the nuts and bolts of it is that it's an online survey to log daily observations of deer and other wildlife. It's voluntary participation. We ask anybody who's a deer hunter in the state who wants to participate to participate. I will say that a few years ago, it was initially available just to archery hunters, but in the last year or two, we've opened it up to all deer hunters. And whereas it used to be an online survey to archery hunters that if they didn't fill it out, we would then send them a paper copy, now it's all just online. So again, it's really easy to get to. And if you're somebody like me who can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, let alone maybe what I hunted last week during during a season, then I wasn't out hunting last week. I just want to clarify that. But my point being that I can't remember from one day to the next what I do. So the really nice thing, if you are somebody who has a smartphone and likes to use a smartphone, is you could kind of be logging that as you're going back to your truck while you're sitting in your deer stand. You can be logging those observations. That makes it really user friendly, I think. And again, it's just basically one way for us to check the deer population model, and we use these surveys to compare that hunter provided data with our population estimates. So I can't necessarily show you what the online survey looks like because that link isn't currently active, but what I can show you is what the paper version looked like a few years ago. The online version is not going to look very different. I mean, essentially for the information it's asking for, it asks you to kind of specify some locations, I think, up to a few locations where you've hunted. We ask for the DPA where you hunted, as well as the nearest town, the distance and direction to that town. And that's essentially for us to then hone in on a township range and section. And then it's just simply what month and day did you hunt? What area did you hunt? How many hours did you spend out there, rounded to the nearest half hour? And what did you see? In terms of deer, we ask you to break it down into the number of bucks, does, fawns, and then if you're not sure, didn't get a good look, there's a category for that. And then other species that we're trying to track and get some estimates or some indices over time include turkeys, coyotes, bears, bobcat, gray wolf, fisher, gray fox, and badger are also ones that we'll ask about. In the end, every year we write up a report for this, and this is what you might see in that report if you were to take a look at it. On the left-hand side is a map. This is from our 2019 data set, and the red dots depict hunter locations. So we had quite a few hunters participate, good coverage across the different zones, the farmland, forest, and transition zones. But I'll mention here in a minute, it's not quite enough hunters, and that's where we're hoping we can get more participation. And in the end, what we do is calculate the number of observations per 100 hours across each of those deer age sex classes. And so this is the data on the right just for that 1 year. But if you can imagine, after 5 years of the survey, we can then look at the number of bucks that were observed per, the mean number of bucks observed per zone, farmland or forest or transition, or per DPA. And we can then, from that, look at the index. Are we seeing more bucks over time, or are we seeing fewer bucks over time? Are we seeing more does or fewer does? We'll also be able to get other parameter estimates that are important to the population model, including things like the doe to fawn ratio, which gives us a measure of recruitment into the population, and then the buck to doe ratio, that sex ratio over time as well too, which kind of helps us know how to adjust and manage our deer through time. So although that map shows a lot of red dots, the reality is we do have some statistical issues, and we're still trying to figure out if this is a viable survey for us. So a couple of the issues are that we have a lot of within year variation, and then just generally a low sample size. It looks like a lot of red dots, but this is a survey that does require a fairly large sample size and a lot of hunters participating in it. And so we're looking to increase participation to better understand the utility of these data as a long-term monitoring option. Again, you're going to start to see some social media blasts here soon, and maybe a news release, a direct emailing to all hunters with an email on file in the ELS system will be coming in the next couple of weeks, and maybe a few other communication avenues. So this is our way of trying to get the word out about this survey and try to increase that participation, because we're really hopeful that if we get a big enough sample size, that this is going to be, again, a great way for us to put some checks and balances in the system of that deer population model that we need to do. All right, that's my first example. Now I want to shift gears, and my bird brain wants to go over to talking about wild turkeys and our fairly new hunter effort survey that we're conducting. So this is a wild turkey hunter effort survey that is in its second year, and I'll give you just a few details here. This is what it looked like this year. This isn't the full survey. This survey works by, initially was a random sample of turkey hunters in just 2 permit areas. And so that was 501 and 507. But this is very similar. We just asked for you to say whether you hunted on a specific day, whether there was a youth present in your hunting party, the county you hunted in, the permit area you hunted most that day. And then also we ask essentially in the end, whether you were successful in harvesting a bird or not. So before we get a little bit more into the specifics of the survey and the reason we're doing it, I want to first talk about the brief history of turkeys in Minnesota. So turkeys were extirpated in Minnesota after 1880. So what extirpated means is they were native to Minnesota, but due to, in this case, overharvest and lack of good regulations, they disappeared from the state. So extirpated just means disappeared. It was part of their native range, but they disappeared. They weren't extinct elsewhere. They just didn't exist in Minnesota anymore. Their historical range was at extreme southern Minnesota and probably southeast Minnesota. Now, in the 1920s, managers and biologists began some reestablishment efforts, but those early efforts weren't very successful because they were taking turkeys from lots of different places within the continental US and trying to transplant them here, and not all of them were well suited to Minnesota's climate and habitat, particularly our winters. So it actually took until the 1970s to figure out that the eastern subspecies is what was best suited to our climate and our habitat. So from the 1970s through the early 2000s, we did some active trap and transplant efforts. The map there on the right shows these efforts. The dots represent the decade, but essentially across those decades, we had over 290 releases of turkeys, and over 5,200 turkeys were released throughout that time. And those efforts ended in 2008 to 2009. And since, we still get reports of turkeys expanding on their own. They're doing really well. Turns out turkeys can do really well in northern Minnesota as long as the snow isn't too deep or they have good access to food. And that was actually research done out of our Mid-Daly group a couple decades ago now by previous researchers looking at basically their thermal tolerances. And turns out turkeys can handle really cold temperatures as long as they have food, probably like the rest of us. They just need to keep that little internal furnace going to keep them warm. And so I've heard reports from our former bear biologist saying that, he's seen turkeys out of the Grand Rapids area as he's walking up to bear dens to do some of his research, and that's something he thought he would never see. But long story short, turkeys are doing really well. And then another little bit of history for those of you who are turkey hunters. The turkey stamp that's required for hunting was first authorized by our legislature in 1996. So it's been around for quite a few years now. So as turkeys have expanded and because they've been doing well, we've progressively liberalized our hunting seasons over time. So in 1978, just within a few years of those first successful establishments, our turkey hunting season was fairly conservative. We only had 2 permit areas in southeast Minnesota, and that's kind of shown in that map there on the left. By 1990, turkeys were doing well enough that we opened up our first fall turkey season. And then the map in the middle shows what things look like for our spring turkey permit areas in 2005. And you can see from 1978 to the early 2000s, we were looking at hunting turkeys across half of the state. The map all the way on the right shows what our turkey hunting looked like as of 2016 when we opened up turkey hunting to the entire state. So anywhere you are in Minnesota, you can hunt turkeys. There's also been some other turkey regulation changes that have come. It used to be that you had to hunt in a specific turkey permit area. Now, and then it was opened up that archery hunters and youth hunters could move. And now we still ask for you to kind of declare a turkey permit area, but even as a gun hunter, you can move across the different turkey permit areas and move around the state. So long story short, turkeys seem to be doing really well. We've gotten more progressive and liberal with our turkey hunting seasons. Turkey hunting is, if you're not a turkey hunter, is hugely popular, and I myself have only been turkey hunting a handful of times. I look forward to doing more, and the reason is it's an amazing way to watch the world wake up. Yeah, you have to get out of bed pretty early and get out into the woods or wherever you're going to do it. But it's so worth it because it happens during spring migration. There's lots of little songbirds passing through the area. You're camouflaged, you're not moving, you're sitting real still. Before you know it, you've got a squirrel on your shoulder, things like that. So it really is just an amazing way to watch the world wake up. And for that reason, I think it's really understandable why it is so popular among hunters. That said, other people really dislike turkeys because they see the nuisance issues. And so these often happen in urban areas where turkeys are trying to coexist with humans, areas where we have bird feeders, and turkeys become problematic. Just like any of us, they'll take a free meal if they can find it. So sometimes they find a feeder in someone's yard and they bring their friends in, or in other cases, they're overwintering in an area and they find a farmyard that has good access to forage. And so I've heard stories of landowners and farmers that are waking up having their morning coffee, and next thing you know, they just have 100 turkeys coming over the hills, coming down into their yard. So understandably, there are some nuisance issues that exist in some areas. But in other areas of our state, people feel like they don't see as many turkeys as they used to. And that actually is an observation a lot of other states have. A lot of the core turkey areas in our southern states, they don't feel like they have as many turkeys. Turkeys are declining and they don't know why. Minnesota seems to be at the leading edge of that. We haven't necessarily seen that decline. We feel like turkey population is still expanding and we don't really know why. We feel like our turkeys are doing well, but all things said, we do recognize that we have a need for better monitoring how our turkey population is doing and estimating our population size. So this is where that turkey hunter effort survey comes along. We just don't have a great way of monitoring our turkeys right now. And so this turkey hunter effort survey is basically a class of statistical models called removal models, which offer one way to track the population through time. And in short, because we get a lot of questions about why does it matter? Why do you want to know how much time I spend in the field and where I hunted? And it's essentially because we use that information about hunter effort and harvest, and then a whole lot of math in the background to then come up with a population estimate. So if you can bear with me and kind of dig back to your algebra days, the basic formula here is the size of our turkey population times the harvest probability tells us what our total harvest should look like. But if we rearrange that formula, then the size of our population should be equal to the total harvest divided by the harvest probability. Well, because there's mandatory registration when you harvest a turkey, we already know the total harvest. What we need to figure out is this harvest probability. And so this is where this hunter efforts survey comes in. We ask folks to tell us how much time they spent in the field, and in the end, whether they're successful or not, because that basically gives us an estimate of the catch per effort, or that harvest probability. What is the likelihood of a turkey being harvested given how much time people spend out there? And from that, we can then get this number. So for this survey, it's in the second year of data collection. It was done in 2000, and then there was a hiatus due to the pandemic, unfortunately. And now we have our second year of surveys out there, and it's initially being piloted in these 2 turkey permit areas, 501 and 507, core part of the turkey range in Minnesota. A lot of hunters hunt these areas, good habitat. But the thing is, in this second year of data collection, we've expanded it a little bit. And again, this kind of similar to the deer observation survey, in that we have some statistical challenges. We just don't quite have enough data. So we're hoping to increase the amount of data we get. So we need a truly random sample to minimize bias, and that's why we kind of have this random selection of hunters in these 2 permit areas where they get an email from us asking them to go online and do the survey. We send out a couple of reminders, and if by the 3rd time they haven't filled out the online survey, we then mail those randomly selected hunters a paper survey. But in addition, this year, our upland game researcher also sent out an email to all turkey hunters with an email address on file in our ELS system. So regardless of what turkey permit area they're in, where they live in the state, whatever, if you had an email address on file and you've bought a turkey license, then you should have gotten an email from us asking you to do this. And so our goal with this year is to compare that truly random sample that pilot study where we're only looking at 2 permit areas with what we get from this more statewide effort. And if it turns out that that's a viable method to collect this data, then that would be how we would move forward with this. And again, our ultimate goal here is to help inform the season setting process and adjust those regulations as needed, because we recognize that we've gotten more liberal. We have a lot of hunters who want us to become even more liberal with our turkey season, but we kind of need to figure out what's going on with our turkey population before we do that. Okay, so again, some parting thoughts that I reiterated I'll reiterate what I said at the beginning. I recognize this is very much a biased perspective from what we do in our wildlife research unit. And so I really do encourage you to check out the chat for some of those links to those other citizen science-based projects that may or may not involve hunters, but citizen science in general. And the DNR volunteer webpage is a great place to start with. And from there, you can find some of those. There's really cool things like Minnesota Bee Atlas Project. There's the loon monitoring and all of that. But again, those aren't necessarily hunter-based citizen science projects, but you should check them out and be aware of them. And again, my plea that if you're a hunter, you participate and receive any of these surveys. So the 2 that I talked about today, the Deer Hunter Observation Survey and the Wild Turkey Hunter Effort Survey, are fairly new surveys. We're trying to get them off the ground, see if they're viable. But some of the other surveys that we've done for a long time, we've seen declining participation, just like we've seen with our license sales and hunting participation in general. And so that figure there on the right shows across the bottom is years, so going all the way back to 1998. So a couple of decades now. The line with the triangles is our small game license sales through time. And then the bars on that graph show the number of usable returns from our small game survey. So of those folks who buy a small game license, we randomly select a small sample of them to do the survey for us every year. And just like our small game license sales, we've just generally had fewer of those surveys being returned through time. And that means we have less information available to us to help then manage these populations. So again, this is kind of my plea that if you are a hunter and receive any of these surveys, or if it's a survey that is open to any hunter, like the deer observation survey, open to all deer hunters, you don't need to wait to receive a survey. You can just go to the website and provide that information. We ask that you participate. And again, help us spread the word. You'll see some social media blasts come out from time to time about these. If you're on Facebook and you're not already tracking, we have our main Minnesota DNR Facebook page, but then we also have one specific to Minnesota DNR wildlife. And I would encourage you to track that. And, that's a really great way to help us spread the word, because you can tag other people that you know who participate in that type of hunting, or share it yourself. And again, just help us get the word about some of these surveys. And with that, just again, thank you for having me today. Let me plug these, plead for some help, and be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Nicole. That was really great information. It was really wonderful to have you with us today and all your expertise. Just remind folks, if you have questions, here's your chance. Talk to a researcher, use the Q&A area, and submit your question. I'm not seeing any. I don't know if Amber or Benji, you've seen any come across, but I don't see one at this time. So we've got several minutes, though, if someone would want to ask a question. I'm happy to ask you one, though, Nicole.
I always wish there was like a little, I don't know if there's a poll button. I always like to know how many people out there would be deer hunters or turkey hunters. And I'm sure the turkey hunters agree with me that it's a really great way to wake up to the world, especially in the spring when migrants, because like if nothing else, if you don't see a turkey, at least you've got a new little songbird practically coming in, landing on your shoulder. That's, I think for me, as a bird brain, as somebody who studies birds, that's the great part about it, is like you're sitting there and you're almost falling asleep, and then suddenly some new little songbird comes along, and it wasn't there the day before, it just migrated back. But so I wish there was a little poll to see how many people out there are different types of hunters, but
Yeah, I've hunted
alas.
like some of the later seasons in the woods. It's phenomenal to see some of the warbler migrations and scarlet
Yeah.
tanagers and things like that in
Yep.
the later seasons too. It's every day is different. It's really cool.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, back when I worked back at Medelia, we were actually collecting the vehicle deer
Mhm.
kills. Is that something you're still collecting? And is that factoring into our population modeling yet?
Yeah, and I can tell you that no, we don't collect the car kill information. Some of the sheriffs, and offices and other law enforcement offices still occasionally send us those copies, but we don't actively track that. We made an effort a few years ago to tell folks that they don't need to send it to us. I could not tell you why we don't do it anymore. I think it might have to do with we got what we needed to out of it, and to some extent, and we don't really use it anymore. But you'd have to talk to Eric Mitchell, is our deer project leader, and he would be able to tell you better why it is that we don't collect that information anymore.
Okay. How about another question on just how do you choose which research projects with that your unit group is going to work on?
Yeah, so again, I think if we're doing our jobs correctly, we are working really closely with our wildlife research, not our wildlife, our wildlife managers, to see what are they seeing in the areas that they manage habitat. What are some of the issues um, that they're trying to address, and they don't know, how to go about managing the habitat, or working with our section leadership team who do help set those season setting, go through that season setting process. And so it could also be external partners, whatever, but basically it starts with conversations about what questions they have. And then it's and then from there we try to prioritize. There's you know, I have no shortage of really cool questions I think we could be asking, but to me, it's kind of thinking, what is the most time sensitive? Where do we have good support for it? What's gonna, in some ways, give us the most bang for our buck right now? Like, what is the thing that we should be addressing now? That other question can maybe wait a few years, because some of these projects, are long-term monitoring projects. They're going to go year after year after year. Others are, 2 to 3 to 4 year commitments. And then we actually kind of go through. So that's kind of how we address and try to prioritize those questions, working really closely with folks. But then what a lot of people might not realize is that behind the scenes, before we ever spend any money or even ask for money for any of these projects, we go through what we call a phase review process. And so it's essentially a peer review on the front end, where our scientists and biologists write a proposal, and then our research supervisors, our biometricians, our research manager, we all get together, discuss which ones to move forward, which ones fit within prioritization scheme, and then they have to give a presentation. It's a lot. It's a little bit, when you're new to our research unit, it's a little bit intimidating. It's almost like being in graduate school again and giving a defense, but you're going forth and basically saying, here's the project I want to work on, and this is why it's important. And then we kind of, so before we ever spend any money, they're kind of vetted on the front end through our research unit to make sure that they're as solid as they can be in addressing those priorities. So um, I'm not sure if that's how other agencies do it, but I think it's a really nice thing for us to vet it on the front end and make sure that it's something we should be spending money on.
Great. Um, and related to that, are there any new emerging, I mean, you touched on a couple of the new things that are happening, but is there any particular emerging issues that you see coming up here in the next few years or that you're really, interested in?
Yeah, so our deer team is just, is really, so I'll talk about our farmland group in particular, because that's what I'm most familiar with. So our deer team just has a lot of projects going right now. And like I mentioned, they all tie back into that deer model. So that fawn project right now is the one they're putting a lot of time and effort into, and having a lot of success with. Brian Haroldson in our group just kind of finished up the 3rd year of that road-based distance sampling project, which helps us come up with deer density estimates. We're hoping that we can make that sort of operational and send it out to our area managers or figure out a way to kind of keep collecting that data over time. On the upland game side, one of the emerging issues, we manage DNR lands, but the fact of the matter is we can only own so much public land, and a lot of what affects our bird populations also happens on private lands. And so on the upland game side, Tim Lyons is going to be moving forward with a project to look at how cover crops are in the landscape are affecting pheasant survival rates, pheasant movement, brood survival, things like that. So that's one I think is really emerging. Regenerative agriculture and soil health are hot topics. I think they're catching on with private landowners. And I think that's one that, we'll have some good information here soon, looking at how pheasants are using and moving and through those things and how cover crops maybe affect survival rates that we see in our grassland habitats. So that's a really neat project I'm excited about. In our other groups, they've got a really cool wood duck project happening in the wetlands group. And like I said, that amphipod project. And then the forest group is just always super productive and churning out a ton of information. So not all of those are hunter-based citizen science projects, but a lot of different work going on.
One on the education side that we should talk about, maybe you mention, is this wildlife camera that just got started this year. You want to mention that at all?
Yeah. So are you talking about the camera traps survey? Yeah.
No,
So
no, the live camera feed that we had out
yeah,
at the
yeah.
sharp-tailed grouse location and the wood duck.
Yeah. So that's essentially our section of wildlife's response to an eagle cam, right? So you can check out the DNR eagle cam, but in our section of wildlife, we have a camera out that we actually move around to different places. So yeah, like you mentioned, it started off on a grouse lek. You could see some dancing. I think then it went to a wood duck nest box, so you can see the process of a hen incubating those eggs and them hatching, and then see them jumping. Yeah, so that's really cool. It's I will admit I'm somebody who sometimes in the background, it's almost like having a fish tank at work. It's like you're working, but when you need that moment to think, you kind of look off and can watch the camera and see what's happening. It's kind of calming, in my opinion, to have that kind of going in the background sometimes. So yeah, that's really neat. I don't know the list of where it's going next, but I know that
I'm not sure either, but check our
yeah,
website. Check the website.
yeah. They just put the link in the chat. Window on Wildlife, and the goal is to help move that around and see some different things as the season changes. So that'll be cool.
Yeah. Amber, are you seeing any other questions or in the chat or anything that we missed?
No, I haven't had any questions come into the chat. We did have one person respond to an earlier question and just indicate that they were indeed a deer hunter. So I think that was an answer to your question, Nicole.
Well, good, and hopefully you have a couple of deer hunting friends that you can pass on the word about this survey. We're really eager to increase participation, and it's like I said, smartphones these days. If you're a smartphone user, it makes it super easy. And if you're not a smartphone user, I'm sure that our staff would be willing to send you a paper version. I don't know if that's in the plans, but I know that some people don't necessarily want to use smartphones or don't want to be tied to them all the time. But yeah, awesome.
I have one other question. I think that we could ask you a little bit of time. I get this question a lot too from folks that students that are either in high school or maybe just starting their college career and they're interested in wildlife and fisheries. Do you have any suggestions or recommendation on the research side if someone was be interested in getting into that as a potential career?
Yeah, there are. It's never too late. I actually worked with a high school student this summer who he already knew what he wants to do, and he's headed off to a school for that, and felt like he was light years beyond me because I didn't really figure out what I wanted to do until I think I was between my sophomore and junior year. But getting started, I think reach out. I'd be happy to answer questions if folks want to reach out to me. There's no one path. I think you can talk to 10 different wildlife researchers and get 10 different answers. But it starts with just starting to take some summer seasonal jobs, or once you're out of school, taking some temporary positions. It does unfortunately require a little bit of moving around. Ideally, housing is provided. A really great resource to check out for some of these jobs is Texas A&M has a wildlife and fisheries job board. In addition to us posting some of our positions on, we have internships through Minnesota DNR for all sorts of things, whether it's wildlife or aquatic invasive species, fisheries. So you can start with our State of Minnesota jobs page. But if you're interested in maybe going elsewhere, like that was how I ended up in Panama and New Hampshire, was, had the opportunity to work for other researchers. And so a lot of those temporary positions and opportunities get posted on job boards like the Texas A&M Fisheries and Wildlife Job Board. Again, my experience in the ornithological world is there's one called Ornithology Exchange. There's the Society for Conservation Biology. All of these places are going to post those positions, whether they're temporary or permanent, entry level or more advanced. So if you're interested, you got to start getting your foot in the door, take some of those seasonal jobs, start to build some experience. And then wildlife research really does require graduate school. So if you want to stay in wildlife research, know that at some point you're going to have to go off and probably at least get your master's. And that basically takes you from helping on another project to leading your own project, thinking about how you design a study to answer questions, how you analyze that data, how you write those reports. And so sometimes that scares people off, but it can be a really good time in your life too, to kind of set that foundation for being a solid researcher later on. So you'll have to go to graduate school at one point if you want to stay in research.
Yeah, and I really like your suggestion of reaching out to staff in Minnesota. We're fortunate we have area offices, fisheries and wildlife all across the state, and I found staff there are really, really willing to talk to students, and
Yes.
and sometimes I know in fisheries, I'm not sure about wildlife, there's even an opportunity to come out and see them netting, and maybe help at least get to hands-on or at least learn directly kind of what they do on a day. So.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that most of our staff are going to be willing to do that and also share their perspective. In wildlife, a lot of our area managers and assistant managers also went to graduate school. So, and then probably wised up and decided they didn't want to stay in research, and so they can give you their perspective too on like I always did research and I always did bird projects. So I have a very sort of limited scope that way. But our area managers are really well, have a great solid foundation for doing the work that they're doing, and oftentimes including research early on. So yeah, definitely reach out to an area office or any of our wildlife research staff if you're looking for insights on that.
Yeah, thanks. I do want to mention that we are continuing this Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series for the summer series. Is going to run for 3 more weeks yet. And next week, in fact, if you've ever been interested in clay target shooting, or you are a hunter and you want to sharpen your skills some other way, then we should be practicing. Obviously, it's going to make you a better hunter, but we'll have someone from our Becoming Outdoorswoman steering committee volunteer come and talk to us about what's the process. I've never been clay target shooting before. How do I do that? Where do I go? So it's a really great introduction to how to do that and get engaged in some of that and what you can expect and where these ranges are and stuff. So that'll be really, really exciting. And we're working on our fall series. So in the next week or two, keep an eye open for new topics for the fall. We've got a really good lineup. We're gonna have some more wildlife folks that'll be joining us to talk about some of the stuff that's out there. And with fall being hunting season, obviously there'll be a lot of hunting type skills that we'll be covering. So, and we record all these again. So check out the recording, share this, and let folks know about the program. So that's all I have. Does anyone have anything else to add?
I'll just add, I was gonna say, you don't have to be a hunter and to enjoy clay target shooting. It's something I've done.
That's true.
And I hunt a little bit, but clay target shooting is fun regardless of whether you're a hunter or not. So
yeah,
I'll try to check that one out next week myself.
And Benji, we were going to talk about learn to hunt.
Yeah, and if anybody is interested in learning a little bit more about hunting, we do are doing our Learn to Deer Hunt program this year down in the Minnesota Valley, St. Croix, and up in Itasca. So there's a link in the chat for that, and you can reach out to James Burnham or Craig Kiger to get more information on that also. So
yeah, thank you for that reminder. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. It's great to have you here, and thank you, Nicole. It was really good information. I'm really glad to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, everybody, have a good week.